We have heard the parable of the sowing of seeds. Of course, Jesus is talking about the care we need to use when we share the good news of God made known to us through Jesus Christ. Jesus is talking about the E word, in other words, the E word, evangelism. Evangelism is not a very popular word among Episcopalians for a number of reasons, which I'll mention. And I know this because for a little while I was program officer for evangelism for the Episcopal Church and got to travel around the country and talk to people about evangelism. I only had that position for a year. They unfunded my program. But I had some fun. I'm not sure how good I was at it, but I had some fun. I did not have fun working out of a skyscraper in Manhattan, though. That's not for me. I'm perfectly happy now being a parish priest. But I've talked to evangelism with a lot of people, and they kind of, I think they don't like the message I gave them. Basically, if your church is growing, if your church is healthy, it's going to grow. If your church isn't healthy, it's not going to grow. It's as simple as that. People used to call me up and say, we're not growing, what can you do? And I said, well, how's your prayer life? And they go, what does my prayer life have to do with evangelism? It has everything to do with evangelism. But let's talk about evangelism anyway. We begin evangelism by listening. And then we listen some more. Because it's only when we really hear the other person that we're going to know how to proclaim the good news in a way that they can actually hear it. And the truth of the matter is that the way that evangelism was done 50 years ago, and sometimes is still done today, simply does not work in most cases in today's world. I know those old methods pretty well. My parents sent me away at 11, and by the time I was 12, I was living with a cousin in Eugene, Oregon, and these folks were very devout Christians. They were Pentecostal. We went to Uncle Dub's church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And then they decided they were going to send me to this program called the Lay Institute for Evangelism. After 2 days of instruction on evangelism, they set us loose on the city of Eugene to save souls for Christ. So there I am, 12 years old. I go to the city park, and here's these 3 elderly men wearing rather ragged clothes, and they didn't smell very good, but I didn't care. They really were interested in what I had to say. And when I was done, they actually kneeled right there in the park and said the Jesus prayer. They accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. And I was tickled. I was successful. I was a good evangelist. But then, of course, each of the 3 elderly men asked if I could spare $1, and I gave them each $1. But I got to go back to the Institute and tell them I was successful. Little did I realize at the time that most likely those 3 gentlemen were buying a bottle of Ripple at the liquor store with the $1 that I had given them. But I thought I was a successful evangelist. Now, the skills that I learned in that class actually came in handy a few years later. I'd run away from a foster home and done some other things, and I ended up in juvenile hall. I hadn't done anything bad enough where they could send me to reform school, but they didn't have any place to send me. They made me a ward of the court. I had to stay in Oregon. All my family lived in California. I burned the bridges with all the family in Oregon. So I didn't know what to do with me. A friend in juvenile hall said, hey, I met these Christians, and they got me a bed in the Nicky Cruz Home for Boys in Fresno, California. Nicky Cruz. He's the character in Wilkerson's book, The Cross and Switchblade, you might have heard. Nicky Cruz wrote Run, Baby, Run. Anyway, Nicky Cruz is about 5 feet tall and about 5 feet wide. A very scary looking guy. He was the president of the Mau Maus during the 50s in New York City. So anyway, I told my friend, I said, hey, send them to me. I got to get out of juvenile hall. So they sent the Christians to me. And by golly, they used the same spiel that I had learned at the Lay Institute for Evangelism. I knew how to respond. And so I responded. I gave the responses I knew they wanted. So they were rejoicing that they saved a soul, and I was rejoicing because I was going to get out of juvenile hall. And I did. Before I say more about Fresno, though, let's talk about that word, being saved. About saving people. I think the best commentary on that term, and how it's misunderstood a lot of times, is to tell the story about Archbishop William Temple. Archbishop Temple was known to be a bit of a grouch when he was not feeling well, and he had gout in one of his legs, so some days he didn't feel well. The story is that one day he was leaving the cathedral by a side door wearing street clothes, and as he started walking down the street, this woman approached him and said, "Brother, are you saved?" And the Archbishop turned to her and said, "Madam, I was saved as a wee lad when I was baptized. I am being saved right now, and I will be saved when my good Lord comes again. Now leave me alone." And marched on down the road. Grumpy, yeah. But actually, it's pretty good theology if you think about it. It's a good response. It captures the centrality of our baptism. We're going to witness a baptism today. The centrality of our baptism as our identity as Christians, as well as reminding us that salvation is always an ongoing process. I was saved, I am being saved, I will be saved. It also points out to us how meaningless some of our church jargon is to those unfamiliar to the ways that we use those phrases. The words matter very much. We need to choose them carefully. So I got out of juvenile hall and was placed in the Nicky Cruz home in Fresno. It was a very strange place. Every weekend, a bunch of us boys would be loaded in a van. We had to go talk to some youth group, and we had to give our personal witness. And if you didn't give a good personal witness, you might lose your bed. And you had to give a fairly good personal witness. Mine was never very good because I wasn't very convinced by all of this. But then, when we weren't giving testimonies for youth groups, we were dropped off downtown Fresno, California with a pile of tracts, and we handed out pamphlets on street corners. I lasted 2 months, and I hit the road again. My point is, I know those old methods well. And I think that in today's society, they are a major turnoff. Beating people over the head with the Bible and telling them they have to turn or burn is the best way I know to make people run away from Jesus as fast as they can. It doesn't work. And I wish folks would quit doing it. But what can we do? We meet people where they are in their spiritual life and avoid the temptation to drag them to where we think they should be. So we begin by listening. We listen to their story. We share our story. Always watching for the places where God's story touches them both. Now, there are going to be those who might claim that such deviation from the pattern the previous generations have used is watering down the message of the gospel. Well, I disagree. The message of the gospel, the healing power of God's redemptive love made known to us through Jesus Christ, remains the same. All that's changed is the way that we package it. And the most prominent new element of that packaging, I think, has to be for Christians to become a little more humble. Those who study such things, really, people did study this, those who study such things claim that a person hears about Jesus Christ 25 times before they make a decision. 25 times. The problem with most Christians is we all want to be that 25th person. We don't want to be the 12th person. We want to be the 25th. Evangelism is not about getting another notch on your ecclesiastical belt. The reality is one plants, another waters, God gives the growth. Beyond that, I think we have to face up to the fact that the turn or burn message is probably one of the major causes for the fastest growing religious identification right now in the current surveys is the nones, those who have no religious affiliation. And this started a long time ago. It started at least back in the 60s. I'm old enough where I can remember in the 50s, if you didn't go to church on Sunday morning, everyone thought you were a heathen. And they wanted nothing to do with you. Everybody went to church. Then in the 60s, the social mores softened a little bit, and it was okay maybe to go play golf on Sunday morning. Or maybe, sleep in a little bit, have a cup of coffee, and read the paper on the patio. And nobody thought anything different of it. So what I call the deadwood fell off. Those people who went just for social reasons quit going to church. And so but those folks that dropped away, They had children, and now those children have children. So we have at least 3 generations of people who don't have any idea what we're doing in church. They certainly don't know the Bible studies. The only time they go to church is maybe for a funeral or a wedding or maybe a baptism even. But they don't know the stuff that we assume we know, so we have to quit using that church jargon. And I suggest that it's not because our culture has become more decadent, and I hear people say that all the time. I just don't think it's true. I don't think there's less people in church because we've become more decadent. I think it's because the church has done a poor job in proclaiming the message. So I think a dose of humility is long overdue. Now, Episcopalians, when talking about evangelism, Episcopalians love the quote from St. Francis, "Preach the gospel if you must use words." Yeah, it's a great line, isn't it? But it's kind of a cop-out. Let's face it, Episcopalians are uncomfortable about talking about their faith. And perhaps it's because in the back of their minds, Episcopalians are aware that that whole thing, receive Jesus or you're going to go to hell, that message makes them uncomfortable. Good, I'm glad it makes them uncomfortable. It just seems a little rude to most Episcopalians to talk about religion too much. So sometimes St. Francis' line is a handy excuse to guard our standards of proper etiquette. And there's some truth to St. Francis' statement. Our actions most definitely are important. But evangelism is primarily about our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. Every relationship requires good communication. So we listen, and then we respond. Not with judgmental cliches, not from a position of superiority, believing that we have something that the other person needs. The reality is that they have probably heard about Jesus 18 times already. So we're not telling them anything new. And also, they might have something that we need to hear. Remember, God is already moving in that person's life. We tell our story. We listen to their story, then we tell our story. We speak of the hope that is in us. And then, yes, we need to follow up that conversation with loving actions. Without evidence to support our words, no matter how moving our story might be, it can be easily dismissed. Remember, we have 3 generations that don't know much about the gospel. At best, they're apathetic to the message. Some, however, are actually antagonistic to the message, and possibly for good reasons, if we're honest. So think about it. Someone considers the followers of Christ to be a joke, and the church to be just another racket to haul in the big bucks. But then they see a Christian community expending their resources on feeding the hungry, on housing the homeless, caring for the sick, and welcoming the outcasts, reaching out to those who most likely will never be able to pay back the church for their outreach. It doesn't make any sense to those on the outside looking in. Why would these Christians expend all these resources on those who live on the margins of society? Unless just maybe they really mean all that stuff about love and redemption. So we've got a lot of work to do to rehabilitate our Christian image in the world today. We have a long history of unhelpful rhetoric working against us. It seems to me the first step is to relearn the art of listening. Informed by what we hear, we can then tell our story and begin to engage in loving actions. Such actions will be evidence necessary for some to reconsider the message we have to offer. Such actions will also put things back in their proper perspective. Rather than striving to be that 25th person, we will be able to refocus on God's mission instead of our mission, and then move with God from glory to glory, transforming this world in the name of Christ. Amen.